My childhood before the war was a rather structured one. My family consisted of my parents and my older brother and I, and we had a governors because my mother worked professionally. My father worked in a military bureau for the Polish State Railroad. My brother Andrzej was a year and few months older than I. We were close, but we were completely different. He was a very intellectual, good student, whereas I was basically a hellraiser. But we were close. We were kind of prepared because we knew that the war was coming. And I was very much involved in spirit of the war because I was very much involved with the Polish military. And I was looking forward towards the war, frankly, at that time, because there was no question in my mind that the Polish army is going to defeat the Germans. The actual start of the war I remember because I woke up to the sound of the radio playing in the living room. So it was the evening as the Polish troops were marching out of Vilno, and the special edition of paper came out, Polish victory, breakthrough in the East Prussia, and so on. My father came in and said, "This is all the lie. The Russians attacked 2 days ago. They'll be in Vilno tomorrow morning." And that's exactly what happened. Next morning, I woke up, and the Russian tanks were on the Cathedral Square right next to our building. At the very beginning, there were very little changes, but slowly the changes came up because the NKVD moved in, which is the secret police. The Russians confiscated our big room, divided into 2 small apartments, and 2 Russians, so young Russian officers with their wives moved in. My mother was bilingual in Russian because she was brought up in Ukraine during the First World War and prior to that. And they were very nice people. They're very normal, likable people. So on a personal level, it was basically no problem. The problem was, of course, was the terror before the war between Germany and Russia, when they started basically taking Polish population to gulags, arresting at night, and about, I think the total was 700,000 or 800,000 Poles were taken to the gulags during that time, all over the eastern part of Poland, including members of our family. The Germans, of course, came very orderly. You know, they were disciplined troops, well-dressed, well-armed. And at the very beginning, the Germans behaved quite correctly because those frontline troops. Of course, once the front moved and the Gestapo came in, then of course the German occupation got much tougher. The Polish freedom was completely curtailed. You know, I could be arrested on the streets. Also, the everyday life was much different because there was a shortage of food. There was shortage of transportation because a lot of machine stock, you know, buses and so on, were confiscated. You know, it was shortages and a fear of being arrested. As a matter of fact, when the Germans came, my stepfather was arrested, and my mother sold the rest of her jewelry to buy him out of the Gestapo. The Germans were not very corruptible. The Russians, you could not bribe them. I think the difference was that in Russia, if they find you that you have been corrupted, you simply were shot. Whereas in Germany, probably the penalties for that were not as severe. So he was released from the prison after about 2-3 weeks and came home in a terrible shape. You know, he was beaten up, so there was blue and black marks on his body, and he was he obviously had vermin because he was immediately, you know, deloused, and also the reality of the life at that time. I think it was later on that really was significant when the Germans were losing in the Battle of Stalingrad. It was a year later. And my mother said, "We'll never see Vilno again, we're going to move to Warsaw." because she pretty much realized that Russia is going to win the war eventually, and that eastern part of Poland will be annexed to Russia, which that's exactly what happened. I was very excited because I've been to Warsaw before the war a few times. It was a larger city, and it was also a new adventure in life. I had absolutely no problem leaving Vilna. The difference was visible immediately. Vilna had noticed a very limited destruction as a result of war, whereas in Warsaw, the destruction was very visible. Their buildings were completely demolished. The royal palace was burned out, and you can also have seen in daily life the reduction of the transportation facilities, the crowd, how crowded the streets were. All the cars, all the motorcycles, and all the buses were confiscated by Germans. My brother and I actually joined the underground together. The connection was made through some of friends that we made who went to the same underground Polish high school. And we kind of realized that they were there. We said we want to join. So a couple of older boys came and started asking us questions. Then one of them looked at the other one and, and he sort of bowed his head, and we were in. So we for the next year or so, almost over a year, we were undergoing the typical Boy Scout training plus paramilitary training. To me and my brother, it was very exciting. First of all, we were always I was always very much involved in the military. I love military. I wanted to be professional officer, of course in the cavalry, nothing else. In the Boy Scouts, as a part of the training, we used to have field exercises to do several things. Basically prepare sketches of terrain, find the north, estimate the heights, and things of that sort. During one of those exercises, we stumbled on a single German older boy from Hitlerjugend in his full Hitlerjugend uniform, with the armband, and the Hitlerjugend had little knives in the shape of a bayonet. Well, what we did is, of course, we beat him a little bit, not too much, but a little bit. Then we took his pants, then we took his belts off, and then we ripped his buttons on his pants off, and we gave him a couple of kicks in the ass, and we start, bleeding him. And then we heard a whistle blowing and a shot in the air, and we saw there's a whole group of the rest of his squad or whatever of Hitlerjugend, together with SA man, the party man, with the pistol who was trying to chase us. So we all separated and started running, and we managed to escape. The Germans were trying to find the people to take first of all, to analyze who potentially could be underground, and number two, for forced labor in Germany. So they did what was called a catch-up in Łapanki. They would select a block of a certain street and block it at both ends, and they check the papers of everyone, and then they had tracks waiting, and they took them to further interrogation and either to concentration camp, prison, or to forced labor. Now, as part of our training as Boy Scouts, we had to know all the pass-through buildings where you can enter on one street and exit on a different street. And it just so happened that in that block where they blocked basically corked both ends, there was such a passageway that we knew. So I double checked, and then we told everybody, come there, you can escape on the other street. And a lot of people just siphon out that way. So my training paid. At the end of July of 1944, there was a big change in Warsaw. Everybody felt that the uprising would be starting soon. because there were indication of the collapse of German front on the eastern bank of Vistula. And that was manifested by the very disorderly retreat of auxiliary German troops with their families, which included Cossacks, Azeris, Simmer, which were all horse-driven. Then a couple of days before, that movement stopped. And again, the German patrols, which kind of disappeared during this period, returned on the streets. And that's when my brother I knew when Uprising started was because my stepfather, whom we knew was in the underground 2 days before, went to put his riding boots and Polish riding breeches, a Polish officer, together with his windbreaker and sort of winked at us and left with the backpack. So we knew it's coming because he already went to his assigned point of attack. Well, at the beginning, of course, everything came to a standstill. The Polish flags appeared all over the city. The barricades were being built. On almost all the crossings, the barricades were built. People came out. You saw the Polish underground soldiers with weapons on the streets. That was basically, and of course you heard the fighting. You heard the grenades, you had the machine guns, and then bombing started. The Stukas, the dive bombers start coming and selectively blowing certain parts of the city. The so-called baptism of fire took place when a couple of soldiers came wanted to see the intersection of those two main streets. And we took them to the attic of our house, broke some observation holes, and were waiting for the appearance of the German movement. And one car went by, there was a shot from our side, nothing happened, and motorcycle went by, nothing happened. Then the tank came from one direction, stopped at the intersection, turned around facing us, and then the hatch opened in the turret, and the officer or commander came out with the binoculars, and our soldier shot him. And as soon as that our German officer slammed on the hatch, the barrel of the gun came up. There was a shot, and a hole opened next to me, about 3 feet in diameter. Luckily, the projectile did not explode because it was probably anti-tank and went right through the building, in one wall, out the other. Germans wanted to attack the opera house. They brought out a group of over 200, 250 Poles, mostly women, and a couple of tanks behind and German soldiers. Escorting towards the building. I don't know what they were trying to do because really the building was very well barricaded. It had high windows. There's no way nobody could climb there. It had a railing on crates on the windows, and they had a very heavy gate. But nevertheless, they're bringing all these people towards our building with the soldiers behind. Nalecz told the best shooters to go on the higher floors and try to pick up the Germans from the crowd. When the crowd came close, he said, "Fire!" to start the firing against the Germans, and he opened the small door in the main gate and started yelling, "Poles, run to the gate, run to the gate." And a lot of people managed to escape. Unfortunately, there are others who were killed. And then what happened after that, they took those people back, and then they executed them later on, all in the ruins of the opera house. About 350 people were shot by machine guns there. And we had the shooting. We kind of realized what was going on. During the fighting, in that defending this thing, we had about 50 killed and 100 wounded out of 200. And we needed very badly a surgeon, because we couldn't evacuate the wounded because there was that field of rubble completely covered by some machine guns from was the crossfire. And we tried to send a couple of people, tried to go, and they were killed lying on that field. And Nalecz and I came with Nalecz, and he was standing on the ladders, looking at that field. And on the other end, there was a hole in the wall connecting to the buildings which were left standing on the other side of that block. And Nalecz told me, "You think you can do it?" I said, "Of course." So he scribbled a note, gave it to me, and I made it across. I was lucky. I mean, I studied the terrain. I knew where the low spots were. So I would run from one to the other, and then finally into the hole. I jumped into the hole as the series of machine guns absolutely missed me literally by a split second. It's all question of luck. The whole question of surviving in a fighting of this type is, are you standing here or 6 inches to the right or 6 inches to the left? In this type of fighting, or any type of fighting really, the question of survival is pure luck, it's pure chance. Are you here, or are you half a feet away or half a feet to the left? And I've seen this many times. I've seen a man who was shot with a series from machine gun of 3 bullets, which one grazed him on here, on the chest, the other one grazed him on the inside of the arm, and the third one grazed him on the outside of the arm. Literally 2 inches or 2 inches to the left, he would have been shot through the heart and through the bone of the hand. The commanding officer of our unit was Captain Nalecz. Actually, he was lieutenant at the beginning of Uprising, and he was a reserve officer of the Polish army and fought in the 1939 campaign. He was arrested and later on was spent some time in Auschwitz, but was bought out from the Auschwitz. He was in the underground from the very beginning, and he was commanding of a cadet officer school or reserve officer school of the unit that I was in. He started the Warsaw Uprising with this group of the cadet officers, which formed the original core of the unit. Then different volunteers joined in. So some total about 360 people went through the battalion at different times. There was never more than 200. At the heaviest fighting in defense of the telephone building, there were about 200 who started. Out of these 200, 49 were killed and about 100 wounded. There's hardly anybody who was not wounded. I was one of those who was not wounded at all. And he was a very good man, a very brave man, very fair man, good commanding officer. He led from the front, not from the back. Very high caliber man. There was a situation where the German used for the first time the special secret weapon called Typhoon Gerät. Typhoon meaning the upstream. It's typhoon, Basically, it was the weapon invented to create a low what is called a thermobaric explosion, which is the explosion of the coal dust or any dust with air, which is a very powerful explosion, but it takes a time to develop, and it has very little noise. It was originally Germans tried to develop that to direct this energy upward to be able to shut down the American bombers. It is never developed for that, but they used it in Warsaw, Uprising, and they used it in our place. One day, I went across the street to a building where it was in our hands, which was a typical European apartment building. You went through the porticuli, through the entranceway, into a little courtyard, and there were 4 wings around the courtyard. And as I walk in, I see the back wing simply lifting, like literally lifting, what looked like a lifting, then collapsing in a pile. And this very powerful, not explosion because there's really no noise, but the pressure wave hit me. And I was disoriented because there was also the very heavy dust which came with it, and also affected my ears. And actually it was kind of tragic because as I was walking in, there were a couple of our women soldiers who were cooking 2 piglets that we found the day before in the cellar, and everybody was looking forward to eating those. As a matter of fact, the reason I went there is because now it shall me go and find out how those piglets are doing. And that's the known use of that gas. We found in one cellar 2 piglets, which were killed and were going to be cooked, and everybody was looking forward to eating a fresh meat for the first time in 3 weeks or 2 weeks. And my commanding officer said, well, go and find out how those piglets are doing. I went across the street to a building, and as I walked through the entrance gateway to the courtyard, I saw the girls waving, so I waved to them. The 2 girls were cooking the piglet in the ground floor. Then all over the sudden, that whole part of the building lifted itself into the air and collapsed in a pile of dust. And the wave, the pressure wave before hit me. I was almost deaf for a while. Nothing happened, but the terrible dust. I think if you've seen the pictures of what happened when the World Towers collapsed, and there was like a wave of dust coming towards people. There was pictures of that. This is exactly how this thing looked like. So sort of a wall of gray dust coming. One day, a German soundtrack pulled to the barricade, and through the PA system came out a voice of a Polish woman claiming that she is a wife of one of the insurgents, and for us to surrender because they're very well treated, there's nothing going to happen to us, and so on. And that was repeated with another woman having the same story. There are a couple of soldiers in our unit who are fluent in German because they were forcibly forced into the German army and they deserted. So they knew not only the German, but knew the slang. So somebody found a big horn used for the old-fashioned gramophones. And through this phone, he started in German saying, look, guys, to the German soldiers, using the colloquial German soldier names, what the hell are you doing here at the time where your mothers and wives and kids are being bombed to hell in Germany, and the Russian armies on the other side of Vistula, they're going to come and get you very soon, we'll get even. So when that happened, there's some, they actually stopped, some voice that you're going to pay for that, you Polish bandits, we're going to kill you all, blah, 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 blah. And then they moved the truck away, never repeated again. Even though my brother and I were in the same unit, we were separated in that I was with my commanding officer on the front line. My brother was a runner attached to the commanding officer of a relief company, and he was in this sort of behind us. And he was also a runner later on in the area command as a runner, that if they have to send the runner through our battalion, he will be the one. we were cut off for about 7, 8, 10 days. We had no contact whatsoever with the rest of the city, or rest of the part of the city. When we were relieved and we reestablished the connection by having the trench built. When we established the connection, my commanding officer and I went to report to the group commander. And after he was talking to the group commander, we went down to the duty room where all the runners were. And because he said to me, okay, let's go and see how Andrzej is, how he's doing. So we went to the room where all the runners were, and he asked, where is the Tarzan, which that was my brother's code name, the runner from Nalecz. And somebody said, oh, they made a soup out of him. Then somebody else said, shut your trap, you stupid moron. Shut your trap, you stupid moron. That's his brother. So that's how we found out. And then we went to my father. Now squeeze my shoulders to come on, let's go look for him. We went to the hospital, field hospital, which was an incredible scene you could imagine. And we tried to find out if he is there. And the nurse said, look, there's absolutely nobody here anymore keeping any kind of control of who's here and who isn't. But there was a priest who was keeping the account, and he was just killed this morning, and here's his notebook. And he gave us the notebook, which the last entry was Andrzej Hryniewicz, Runner Tarzan from our battalion, died of wounds that morning. He was wounded severely by a mortar and undergone the amputation of both legs and an arm. So we left the hospital trying to look for the graves because nobody knew where he was buried. And we looked in the vicinity of the hospital, and we couldn't find a grave because most people were buried in the paving slabs of the sidewalks were removed. That's where the graves were. Most of the graves were, or in the courtyards. Again, the same thing. Remove the paving of the courtyard and bury people. We couldn't find anything. When the war ended, the exhumation of the bodies started. And this was the war that, sorry, not the war that ended, when the Russians came and that part of Warsaw was liberated. My mother and I went to see if we can find it. And we went to the Red Cross, said we're just starting exhumation of all the bodies, and we took our information and they will inform you if we find him. And he was finally found, and we got a notification that he was found and buried in this temporary grave, so and so, where they had 7 names of known and 53 or 57 unknown people buried in this grave. The reason nobody knew who he was because he had his military ID and other papers that he had put into the bottle, which was tied to his neck. So this way the body was identified. I did not tell my mother that my brother was killed when I returned from the old city. When I returned and came to the apartment, I knocked on the door, and my mother opened, and then she looked and asked me, "Where is Andrzej?" So I repeated the story that we were agreed on, that my brother was wounded and evacuated to a different part of town. It was about 2 to 3 weeks later, one day, where we're in different parts of town, and I came home. I came where we were stationed at that place and lay down on the bed with my mother, simply because nobody took the clothes off. We just lay on the bed, and I realized that she was crying. And then she turned to me and made but basically could be a question, or a statement. Andrew is dead. which in Polish language we interpreted as a statement or a question. And I simply said yes. Now, who told her, I don't know. But that by itself, she accepted, but it was later on, after the war, that she came across a woman, who was present at his death, or at his wounding. And she, apparently what happened is that he looked at his legs and said, I'll never be able to ski again. Yes, we received, at the very beginning of Uprising, the Royal Air Force, combined with the Polish Air Force station in Italy, were supplying us. However, the losses were very high because because of short nights, the time when the planes were coming back through the Alps, the German night fighters were waiting for them. So after a while, the Brits said that the losses are not acceptable, so the British crews no longer flew. However, the Polish crews were flying, and also the volunteer, I think the South African Army Air Force, were flying supplies. At the same time, Churchill wanted Roosevelt to put pressure on Stalin to allow the use of the American Air Force base in Ukraine, in Plootsi. There's a fully manned Air Force base there with American personnel which were servicing the American bombers flying from Italy. And Roosevelt didn't want to put pressure on Stalin. It wasn't until towards the end of the Uprising that Stalin gave permission for one drop. And that drop took place in September, I don't remember exactly, 12th or 13th, something like that, where we couldn't believe this huge armada of the planes arrived, flying very high. This is the first time actually I saw the vapor drones, the vapor trails behind the planes, because up to that, no planes flew that high. And then the parachutes are coming, and everybody was saying, oh, Polish paratroopers are coming. Because there was a Polish paratroop brigade in England, which was the only unit of the Polish army, which were outside of the control of the Allies, specifically only by the Polish control. But they were dropped at Arnhem, so they were not there. But it was basically the supplies, which was fantastic stuff, except we only got 10% of it. But the drops which really helped us was at the very beginning, when at night, British Royal Air Force and the Polish Air Force and the Australia and the South Africans were dropping. And then we received what we really needed, which is German ammunition, Piat, which was the portable infantry anti-tank weapons, which are very effective, and grenades. Those are basically the three most important weapons that we needed, plus additional weapons like submachine guns and so on. Towards the end of the defense of Old City, where the Germans were really putting all the effort to eliminate the Old City, we received the order from our superiors in the center of the city to return to the center. The commanding officer, and I went with him to the commanding colonel, which commanded the defenses of the Old City. And he said, I received this order. However, I am at the tactical command of your tactical command, and I will do whatever you want to do. And he said, I would like to have all your soldiers capable of fighting to remain, but I will allow the evacuation of wounded. And he said to him, well, could I send my runner to give that reply? And so the commanding officer gave the pass, because you cannot enter the sewers without a pass. The military police was controlling. Enter the pass for send the runners. And I and one other cadet officer who was slightly wounded were selected to go with the worker who knew the sewers. And what happened is that it was around midnight when we came towards the entry of the sewers. And there was a little misunderstanding between my commanding officer and the officer commanding there, who did not want to let us in. So I don't care what it says on the pass. I'm not letting them go. And my Hryniewicz took the pistol out, put it aside. Oh yes, they're going. And it was a go. And we went into the sewer and went through the sewers. The sewers at that time yet were running relatively free and not. There were not what happened later on when masses of people tried to evacuate, created all kinds of bottlenecks, dead bodies and everything. But where we went, it was really relatively easy, because the main sewer where we started was very, very large. There were actually 2 walkways on both sides, and we could walk with the head up. The second sewer was much smaller, but I could walk with my head up, whereas the grown-ups had to put their heads down. But then we finally came to the last section, which was a sewer pipe which was literally 90 centimeters high by 45 centimeters wide. And the guy who was escorting us gave us each a piece of stick, about a little bit shorter than the largest diameter of that pipe. And said, you just get into the pipe, you put the stick in front of you, you wedge it and you pull yourself. And then you lift it up, you wedge it and pull yourself. And of course, the bottom was very slippery. There was no problem of sliding on it. And that was the last probably 100, 200 feet that we covered that way. And then, of course, we came out. Of course, we're covered, in slime. So we're immediately taken to the bus, which was still open for soldiers only. And we took a nice, warm bus for the first time in a month. And my uniform was washed and pressed. And that's where then later on went to see my mother. The uprising in Warsaw never managed to capture whole Warsaw. They captured certain sectors of the Warsaw, and the Germans still maintain pathways, particularly in the east-west, to allow them to evacuate the troops from the east bank of Vistula. Now, the old city was a small enclave, which was the first one to be set upon by the Germans to eliminate. The only communication was through the sewers, because their German presence on above that. And then again, the center was again also divided in such a way that the Germans actually controlled the main thoroughfare, but they couldn't use it because we controlled a couple of crossings. But those crossings were under heavy fire, so you have to be very careful crossing. There were barricades on both sides to allow people to cross. And I went home, and I had a meeting with my mother, and I asked about my stepfather, and she said that he's such and such a place, that he has been wounded at the beginning of the uprising. He lost an ear. He was wounded in the head. And I had a premonition, because when he was in war, when he lived in Vilno, he went to one of the fortune tellers, who's supposed to be very, very good. And he asked him, where is the war going to end? And this man told him, you don't have to worry about it, because before the war ends, you first be wounded and then you'll be killed. And that's actually what happened. He was killed about a week later after I came back. When the time came to leave the old city and come to center where my mother lived, I asked my commanding officer, what should I tell my mother about Andrzej, my brother? And he said, why don't you tell her that he'd been wounded and evacuated to a different part of town? So this is what I told my mother. And I knew that she didn't believe me. I could tell. And later somebody spilled the beans and told her that Andrzej was actually killed. I came late one night because we shared the room towards the end of Uprising, and she was lying on the bed quietly, and I realized that she was probably crying. And I, took my shoes off and just lay in the uniform right on the bed. And she made it could have been interpreted as a question mark or a statement, and which simply said, "Andrzej is dead." And I said, yes. The fall of the old town was not the end of the uprising. It was the first months. And of course, we tried to, they tried to evacuate most of the troops, and most of the troops got evacuated, and certain amount of civilians were evacuated, but it didn't. When the old town fell, it was a bloodbath there, because Germans burned alive all the wounded in the hospital. Even though many soldiers, German soldiers who were there, being taken care of just like anybody else, tried to prevent them. The German doctor, military doctor, tried to prevent that, and the SS guy said, "Look, you want to be like them? I can shoot you right here, nobody will know about it." Well, my commanding officer in private life was a plastic artist and a graphic artist. It was very good, and he designed a shoulder patch. So when we moved from the old city to the center, the fighting got a little bit more stable, not like it was in old city. It was very dynamic. We're basically defending certain parts of town, and Germans were not as aggressive in attacking us in the old city. And so he designed a shoulder patch of our unit, which basically has a motif of old city, which is the monument of a column to King Zygmunt, which was standing in front of the royal palace. So it's basically that column in the middle with sort of silhouette of buildings behind, and the name of our unit and the dates. And one of the Greeks was a draftsman, so he was drafting this on a piece of cloth with the white and black ink. And the other one, I had brand new one, which I smuggled, which I took with me after the Uprising, and I've donated it to the Museum of Warsaw Uprising recently. After spending the first night, I asked my mother where Victor was happening and so on. So my mother told me that he was wounded, that he's fine, that he's in a very special unit, and they headquartered in the post office bank building in nearby, about 3 blocks away, which had several layers of basements, very, very, very well protected and strong basements below. And that's where the hospital was, that the headquarters were, and all kinds of sort of sensitive things. That morning, the German Stukas bomb had a lucky shot that the bomb fell into the elevator shaft and went all the way through the elevator shaft, all the way down, and exploded at the bottom where all the hospitals and all the things were. And of course, it was a confined blast, therefore it was very, very, very fatal, all those people that were killed. Well, it was towards the end of the Uprising. It was like a round of promotions and so on, and I was promoted to the rank of corporal for the bravery exhibited during the fighting in the Warsaw Uprising. And of course, it was a very emotional for me to be now I'm a real soldier, And I had one of our woman medics made a shoulder pads for me with the 2 white stripes, which indicated my rank as a corporal. When Warsaw Uprising capitulated, Germans agreed to respect the combatant rights of the Polish underground. I desperately wanted to go to the prisoners of war camp with the rest of the battalion. My commanding officer said no way, that because my brother was killed and my stepfather were killed, that I have to go out as a civilian with my mother. I was devastated by that. But then, you know, I accepted because after all, there's nothing else I could do about it. So I received my goodbye pay of $20. The Polish underground had a certain amount of treasure of the bill, so every soldier got $10 American dollars. Well, the units were all assembled in the marching order with weapons, but no ammunition, and nobody could have any piece of German army clothing or that I was said no German army clothing, because we use a lot of German uniforms, particularly the smocks, the camouflage smocks. So basically, there were sprinkling of the pre-war army uniforms. Otherwise, basically, some sort of overalls that certain units wore. Otherwise, are civilian clothes with the armbands. Units assembled in a marching order with backpacks or rolled blankets, and they march, giving out the weapons as they, you know, in the control points. The German officers saluted Polish officers. Polish officers saluted Germans. It was all very nice. Theoretically, it was an honorable capitulation, so the Polish officers could keep their sidearms, meaning swords, which is kind of everybody laughed when that article was read from the capitulation agreement. But with very few exceptions, the Germans observed completely the agreement in accordance with the Geneva Convention. They were also threatened by the Allies of the repercussion on their prisoners of war if they not respect the combatant rights of Polish soldiers. Well, we were in a little village in Poland, and there was a line Germany constructed ahead of time, little line of defense. In the evening came a German infantry squad, which included one Polish soldier, or one Pole who was drafted into the German army because he lived in Silesia. And he told us, you know, we'll be leaving first thing tomorrow morning, and the Russians will be here tomorrow. And sure enough, at the daybreak, they left. And then about 2 hours later, I get in front of the hut where was a building where we're staying, and I see a funny-looking small horse with a funny-looking soldier on top with the submachine gun. It was the first Russian. I think that without Warsaw Uprising, there would never have been a solidarity movement which basically defeated communists in Europe. Same as without Polish Bolshevik War or previous uprising, there would never have been a Warsaw Uprising. I mean, we're all in the spirit of our ancestors who fought in all those national uprising mostly against the Russians. Basically, at stake was the future government of Poland, hoping that the right Polish government was the right Polish army, which was the Home Army and the Polish government in exile in London, would have a control of Warsaw as a capital, and that allowed them to have the countermeasure against the communists. That, unfortunately, turned out to be futile, because the Allies did not support that position. Yeah, there was a lot of camaraderie. There was a lot of, later on, as things became more and more dire, there was a lot of lovemaking, I'm sure. I mean, I've heard what was going on, the noises and so on. And there was a certain amount of drinking. There was simply, you know, you may be dead tomorrow, so let's live it up. And at the beginning, there was no shortage of alcohol, because Germans in Old City had a huge storage rooms of very good French brandy and champagne. Part of what the Grey Ranks used to do was this sort of a propaganda war against the Germans, which is putting the signs of the fighting Poland, or drawing the swastikas hanging from the gallows. On the day after Easter of 1944, my brother and I were riding on a streetcar through the Warsaw, and there was a wet day. There was water in these gutters. My hat was blown and went into the water. I jumped off the streetcar to pick up my hat. I gestured to my brother to continue going, and I stood there in front of the huge crystal large windows to what used to be a nightclub, which was then a facility only for Germans called the Soldatenheim. And since nobody was around, I took my wet hat and I painted a beautiful gallows with the swastika hanging. And when I sort of went back doing my work, I was grabbed by some German soldier and taken inside. And a couple other soldiers who taking their belts off to beat me up. However, some elderly, corpulent men came out, and who was obviously running who obviously before was a restaurant owner or something, judging by his girth. And he asked the soldier what's going on. They pointed out of the window. Then he asked me, what's my name? So I said, John Doe. Where's your father? I said, oh, my father is on the Eastern Front, that is the Russian front, working for the German army in the Grosse Harzwalder. So he told the soldiers to leave me alone, and so they simply gave me a couple of kicks in my butt and threw me out. Otherwise, I probably would have wound up in a concentration camp, because any act of this type were punishable by that. The problem is that actually during the uprising, I saw Andrew very few times. Literally, I can count them on the fingers in my one hand. Because even though we were the same units, I was runner to the commanding officer, and he was a runner to one of the company commanders, which really was the reserve company. So quite often we were on the front line, he was in back. So once we started, when we were doing the first fighting in the old city, he came once, and I saw him, and I was very envious because he had a small pistol, and I didn't. And then when we were relieved in the city, in the city hall, I found him again in headquarters, sort of in a hotel, which were our relief place where we were, and he had a uniform for me that were just captured from Germans. Next day, a couple of hours later, we were called in to retake one of the lost positions, and then I didn't see him until. Then I never see him after that. When we arrived in Warsaw, both Andrzej and I wanted to join Polish Underground. And we knew that it existed, we know about it, we read about it, and in the underground press. And the question was to find a connection, which we managed to do about a month later, when we made a contact with the underground Polish high school. Actually, my mother made a contact. And through boys who were there, we were accepted into the Grey Ranks, into the Polish Boy Scouts.